For our acrylic practice, we're just going to use the back of our watercolor practice sheet. So you want to turn it over onto the back to the white side. And we're going to divide this first in half. So this is an 18-inch long sheet of paper when it's in landscape view. So I'm going to make a mark at 9 at the bottom and at the top. And once I have those two marks, then I'm going to connect them and draw a line to divide that paper in half. At the moment, we are definitely going to do an acrylic practice. So we're going to use the top part here for our acrylic practice. And if time allows, or if materials allow, we may get into some water-based oil practice also. So that's why we're dividing this into half. So my next step is I want to divide this up into some sections, just like we did the front with our watercolor. So I have 9 inches here, so I'm going to make 3-inch sections. So I'm making a mark at 3 and 6. And again, I'm in landscape view. Moving my ruler to the top, I'm going to make marks at 3 and 6 up top. And then I'm going to connect those marks just like I did to get my center line to create divisions. Once I have those 3 rows, I'm going to turn my paper into portrait view, and this top half I'm going to divide up into 4 sections. So it measures 12. So I'm going to make these sections 3 inches apiece. So 3, 6, 9, 12 is at the end of the paper. Move to the top part of that section, and again 3, 6, and 9. So for our practice, we need at least 8 sections that I'm going to go over with you. So realize that these 8 different techniques we're going to go over together are just some basics. Just like in our watercolor side, I did try to cover a lot of the watercolor practices because a lot of you are unfamiliar with watercolor. But there are a lot of other techniques out there, not just the ones I've shown you. So the same thing applies to acrylic. So no matter what I introduce to you in class, realize that if you go to use these materials in any of your projects, you will want to look up some information on how to use them specifically for the imagery or concept that you have developed. So again, we're just going to do some basic ones here. So the first one here is going to be wash. The next one is going to be glazing. We're going to do some dry brush. We're going to do a little wet on wet. So some of these terms should be familiar to you. We're going to do a little bit of sgraffito. And this is also just basically scratching the paint. We're going to do a little bit of technique with the sponge. Masking. And this one is only going to be done with tape. We can't use the masking fluid with the acrylic. and negative space painting. Now again, this is definitely just a pared down version compared to what we did on our watercolor side. You can use some of those other techniques we covered in watercolor with acrylic, so that's why I left you some room here for you to experiment a little bit after we cover these 8 together. So for my acrylic practice, I'm just going to get a couple of colors. In this case, I got the subtractive color primary colors. I'm going to need, of course, a bin with water and at least one paintbrush. Now, you are not using the paintbrushes that we used for watercolor. Those paintbrushes are only for watercolor. The paintbrushes we are using for acrylic are located in a different area of the room. So make sure when you are doing this that the container, the black container with the paintbrushes that we've been using, is not being used with acrylic paints. And of course I have a paper towel. So let's start with the wash. The wash is very simple. Remember how we talked about wash when it came to a watercolor? And it was just pulling some of the pigment into the water so that it had a nice translucency or almost opaqueness to it. So a wash in acrylic is just taking the paint as is and applying it evenly to your surface. Now, our acrylics are not heavy bodied, so you got to realize there are different types of acrylic paints out there. Some are heavy bodied, some are a lot thinner, as ours are. So ours are going to show a little bit more of the paper through them than a heavy bodied acrylic. I'm going to clean out my paintbrush. And with acrylic, it's going to take a little bit more to work that paint out. It is water soluble, but it is definitely thicker than our watercolor paints. So make sure you are definitely using that half of the brush bin that allows you to work your bristles against it to clean them out. Glazing is similar as what we discussed in watercolor. So I'm going to take some water and I'm going to pull over some of my color. In this case, I'm going to use some blue. So I'm thinning out the paint. Now realize you can thin acrylic out with water, but you are also weakening the chemical bond that helps it hold together. That is why they make things like acrylic mediums. So in a good project, if you want to work with a glaze, talk to me and we'll get out some acrylic mediums for you to be able to thin out your paint without damaging the chemical structure that lets it bond together. But for now, for our practice, thin down acrylic with water is going to work. And I'm going to apply this so you can see it does thin out. Kind of has that watercolorish look and that it's staining the paper. We could definitely see the white of the paper showing through. And I'm going to let that dry just like I did with my watercolor practices. My next one is dry brush. So dry brush is the exact same thing with watercolor for acrylic in that we don't want a lot of paint in our paintbrushes. We want the bristles to kind of separate a little bit. And we're going to just let the bristles kind of show the movement of the paintbrush because we don't have a lot of paint loaded in there. So dry brush, after you clean out your paintbrush, if you're going to switch colors with it, you got to make sure you dry it out. So I just take and squeeze the bristles with my paper towel. And you can come in with other colors. Just remember, we're trying to remove some of that paint from the bristles so that it's not as thick. And just brushing it on. So this can be a nice way, depending on what your concept may be, of adding some texture and or even an interesting way to maybe add value, again, depending on the texture you're working with. And you'll also notice that working with dry brush technique in acrylic is a lot easier than it was in watercolor. Wet on wet is the same. We're going to first wet the paper. And we're going to apply wet paint. So whether that is a glaze you made or one of your colors as its original thickness, the wash consistency. This paint is wet. It may not be very liquidy like a watercolor paint is, but it is still wet. So applying it to an already wet piece of paper will allow it to kind of blend together a little bit, bleed together, and kind of give you a watercolor-like effect. For this next one, we're going to need a popsicle stick. And this is sgraffito or scratch. So for this one, you're going to apply a wash. You know what, let's do a little color mixing here. Since I'm just using 3 colors, I'm going to pull some of my magenta over, clean out my paintbrush so I don't contaminate any of my other colors. And I'm going to pull over some of my cyan, mix that up, get a purple color happening. And I'm going to apply this purple color to my paper. And you got to work quick with this, especially with us being on paper, because it will dry. And then I'm going to take my popsicle stick and I can then scratch off that paint. So again, depending on what your concept is, could be an interesting way to add texture or cross-hatching highlights in this case instead of shadows. Now, unlike watercolor, it doesn't work the opposite, where if the paint is still very wet, it will run into the grooves and you have to let the paint dry a certain amount of time, because again, acrylic is a little bit more heavy bodied. So working with a sponge, again, we've done this before. You want to take a sponge, slightly dampen it so it's not dry and stiff, and then you just pick up some color and sponge it on to your canvas or your paper. If you go to change colors, make sure you wash that sponge out, get all the color out of it, because you don't want to, again, contaminate your original color. I like to check it with my paper towel. If I don't see any pigment coming off on my paper towel, it's good to go. And I can then come in with as many colors as I want and sponge them in. And again, this is a great way to add some texture depending on what it is you're working with in your imagery. And I often even like to use it as an overlay. Something that, or maybe if it is going to be a texture, I already have built up maybe some values or some sort of value structure underneath it first, and then come in with it as a way to just add some texture. For our next one, this one's pretty easy in that this is just similar to what we did with masking fluid and tape before with watercolor. But again, you can only use the tape with acrylic. The masking fluid is just too thin and usually the acrylic dries too thick over top to allow you to remove the masking fluid later. And also, because the acrylic is thicker, not as thin, you don't have that resist technique going on in which the paint would run off of the masking fluid. So when we mask, we usually use tape, and it can be an area in which we want to block off and keep white, or if we wanted to section off an area so that we could have some nice, clean, straight lines to create some geometrical shapes or other forms, then we can mask there. So once that is applied, I'm going to take my paint, and this time I'm going to make a little bit of green here, just so I have a little bit of variety on my paper. So I've pulled over some yellow, cleaned out my paintbrush, going to pick up some of my cyan, mix them together, and apply this. So if I want to stay just within that tape there and create a green triangle here, I'm going to just paint within that section. So that is one way in which we use masking tape and masking techniques with acrylic. If I'm just using it to block off an area to keep white for now, as what this strip of tape up here would be, then I'm just going to go ahead and paint right over top of that, and then eventually remove the tape. And just like before with negative space, we want to paint a color first. Now again, we're working with thin-bodied acrylics, so I'm going to go with a light color first and apply a wash of it. And let that dry. Now what you're going to notice is our acrylic doesn't take too long to dry because it is a thinner body. It's not as thick, so that means the air can get through it to the paper surface a little bit faster, and it can dry out a little bit quicker. But I want to let that dry, and it looks like my glazing section is dry already, so I'm again going to create another wash. Another glaze, and I'm going to thin out some paint. So again, something that may mix with blue, or in this case cyan a little bit. So I'm taking some watered down yellow and applying that glaze over top, and you can see there where they overlap each other, I get a green color starting to show through. Now the nice thing about working with a glaze, if I am working with a acrylic medium, it's not going to soften back up. But since I worked with water, remember how I was stating that the water will break down the chemical bonds of the paint? I don't know if you can see, but that little tinge of green color that got pulled over with my yellow, because my blue is no longer able to bond together very well. So if that's an effect you want, a way to blend colors, then you can thin out with water. If you want to create a glaze to show something transparent over something else that's transparent, then we'll want to look at acrylic mediums. But I can, create a glaze using any of my colors over top of another, just to create some interest in a painting, or again, a way to create some detail, like a plaid shirt. Glazing always makes me think of plaid. Okay, so my negative space still has a little bit of shine to it in some of the areas, but for the most part, it should be dry enough for me to go on and finish up this example. So just like before, I'm going to take a color that is darker than it. We haven't done magenta over top of yellow yet. And I'm going to take a paintbrush and I'm going to just paint around an object. So if I wanted a yellow lemon with a magenta background, well then I could paint the yellow down first. Again, we're working with thin-bodied acrylics. And then come in and paint around the lemon with my magenta to create the magenta colored background. Is it the most practical? No, but sometimes we forget things. Maybe we're working in an area and we realize, oh, there was supposed to be an object there this color. You already have that color laid down just by chance, and you are now able to just paint around the shape to create the negative space of it. So again, you would pick a lot better paintbrush instead of a big one like I have here. But that would be negative space painting. Again, we're painting around the object shape we want, leaving the shape to come out because of this void where we didn't paint. So that is some 8 simple basic techniques with acrylic. Now what I'm challenging you to do is to take your 4 remaining spaces, to look online at what some other artists have done with acrylic paint, some techniques they use, or to take some of the techniques we've talked about over on the other side that you think would work with acrylic and try them out in these 4 spaces. And if you find more or want to try more, then divide these 4 spaces up in half and you have a section for 8 different techniques to try out. So the reason why I'm not giving you the answers to all of them like I did in watercolor, which as I already mentioned really wasn't the answer to all the possible techniques, but there's quite a number of them, is because I also want you to get more used to learning how to look for resources on your own using the tools we're given, in this case your Chromebook. As an artist, it's not only developing your skills and your talents, but it's also developing the ability to research, and sometimes that research involves how do I use a certain material. So now that I have demonstrated these things, I can remove my tape and we can see how there's a little bleed of the paint underneath the surface of the tape, and that does happen at times. But you can see how the masking gave me some pretty clean edges there to my shape. And when I remove this piece here, again, a white void with some nice clean edges up against it. So that's it for my teacher guided instructions for you. Once you complete these 8, then you need to complete at least 4 more. Again, they can be from your watercolor practice if you feel that technique can be used with a thicker paint, or you can get online and find some examples, follow along with someone, and try that technique out. In fact, I'm going to require that at least 2 of them come from the internet and are not similar in any way to your watercolor practice. So now that my practice is done, it is time for me to clean up. If you have quite a bit of paint left over Bring it to me, we'll put it back into the bottles until we see what kind of medium you are actually using for your painting. I will take anything that's not contaminated and put it back with the rest of the paint. You want to make sure whatever sponge you used is well washed out, and especially if you didn't follow direction and used any of our watercolor materials with this, then you want to make sure that that natural sponge is extremely clean and that no acrylic paint is left inside of it. You also want to make sure that you have washed your paintbrushes and taken out a lot of the excess moisture. We don't need them dripping wet when we store them. And lastly, you will have this at the drying rack. Your name should already be on it, but if it's not, make sure your name is on it. And you're going to take your dirty water to the sink, empty it out, put some clean water in it to get any of the sediment that may have settled to the bottom, and dump it again. And then we always like to remember put some paper towels in there so that the plastic containers don't stick to each other when we stack them. So make sure you clean up, make sure your name is on your paper and that it is on the drying rack. And that is it for our practice today.